certain currency or a certain currency denominated asset versus another asset, right? I mean, I do think like the whole, you know, kind of U.S. posture towards economic sanctions, like if that changes, that obviously would matter. But like, I think if we get too caught up in that, it kind of loses the point of that. There are fundamentally like broader macro trends that are driving emerging markets to want to hedge dollar. I mean, to basically like think about how to reduce dollar exposure.
Right, regardless of U.S. administration leadership.
Yeah, I think so, right? Yeah. I mean, I think yeah.
I would offer that interest in promoting the renminbi as a internationally recognized currency, irrespective of everything we're talking about on economic statecraft and sanctions. So just as you say, there might be interest to move away from the dollar that have nothing to do with sanctions, there's also Chinese interest to increase renminbi's visibility and acceptance irrespective of sanctions. You've got those forces already out in the water, and I think the way I see it is the perceived abuse or overuse of sanctions intensifies the trend. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but...
Well, yeah, I think like the sanctions are only one part. Like, I think so much of the big policy is just like, economic sanctions are driving China.
So maybe you can sit on the far side and then
A
Robbie
driver.
Adam.
Right.
Whatever.
Yeah,
that's
I don't know
where I put the mic, so I'll have you.
Okay.
Right.
And like, this has been a debate in Beijing.
All right, whenever you guys are ready.
Ready.
Take the seat with the microphone.
Yeah.
Actually on the far side.
The far side with the mic. That's where I'll sit.
Yeah, and just wait for Zachary's thumbs up before you get going. All right. Okay. Showtime.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the event today. It's so great to see you guys in the room and for those joining virtually. I'm Sydney Mackey. I'm a markets editor at Bloomberg News, usually based in New York, but I'm really excited to be here in Washington today for this discussion on the rhetoric versus reality of BRICS Dedollarization here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I think this theme is extremely relevant today for a few reasons. Of course, we have expanding BRICS bloc. And in addition to that, the impact and fear of sanctions coming across BRICS, dollar shortages in other nations, and in Washington, there are questions about how to respond to this trend. So joining today to discuss this theme is Robert Green, who is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Technology and International Affairs Program and Asia Program, focusing on Chinese financial sector trends and on topics at the nexus of cyberspace governance, global finance, and national security. We also have Adam Zubin, a professor of practice at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Previously, he served as the acting Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the U.S. Treasury Department. Thank you both so much for joining today.
Thank you. Thanks.
So just a quick note, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have them virtually, do type them in the chat, or go ahead and scan the QR codes that are in the room and type out the questions. All right, let's jump right into it. So Robert, starting with you, this is clearly a theme that is obviously gaining momentum, but are we really at a turning point when it comes to BRICS de-dollarization?
Yeah, thanks. And it's a great question. I think there's a number of indicators that suggest it's going to be a very significant year for these types of issues. To begin with, as you noted, the BRICS bloc has expanded, right? And this is, you now have a wide variety of types of countries that have entered into the bloc. You have, on one hand, Iran, which is, heavily subject to heavy U.S. economic sanctions. And then on the other hand, you have Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have dollar-pegged currencies. And then you have Egypt and Ethiopia, which are in the midst of, significant economic turmoil. So quite a variety of countries to have included. You had Argentina, which was invited to join the bloc, decline the invitation, and is now pursuing a policy trajectory of dollarization. So that also presents a very interesting fork in the road. On top of that, you have Russia chairing BRICS this year, indicating that it wants to host a lot of events in Russia about a variety of policy issues, but inevitably the topic of advancing local currency usage will come up. And then you have a lot of, we're going to see what's the result of several policy efforts that happened last year involving China and the use of the renminbi. For example, the establishment of a renminbi swap line between Saudi Arabia and their central bank and China's central bank. So those are all indicators that it will be an interesting year. At the same time, the dollar remains the dominant currency in trade and finance. And there's a lot of network effects associated with that dominance. And so whether we will see and the degree to which we will see other currencies make inroads, that's going to be important to watch. But there are a number of factors that make it a very timely to be having this discussion in January of 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. And Adam, Robert mentioned the role of China and the Chinese currency in this discussion of de-dollarization. I mean, we've seen an expanded use case in places like Russia, for example. And I'm curious what stands out to you about the fact that it's the Chinese currency that is taking a larger and starring role in this de-dollarization trend.
Well, thank you for the question, Sydney. I also want to thank the Carnegie Endowment for the invitation to be here. And for those of you who haven't yet read Robert's paper, I strongly encourage you to do so. It is one of the more rigorous and in-depth analyses of a very challenging and topical issue that I've read. And I think it adds a lot to the current debate. So please do make sure you read it. In terms of China's role, China, I think, has a number of goals, I would say, independent of anything having to do with the US, sanctions, and geopolitics. China has been making efforts over the last decades to try to assert its place at the international table, especially when it comes to the most established countries. And you see that in the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF. You see that in terms of development banks. All right, so China wants to be taken seriously as a global peer to the US. And for that reason alone, probably wants to see the renminbi recognized as one of the world's leading currencies. And that trend would be ongoing regardless of how the US was using or not using sanctions. In addition, though, there's no question that China has bristled at what it sees as the US abuse of economic statecraft. And the field that I work in, sanctions, economic statecraft more broadly, certainly has been very manifest over the last several decades, certainly since 2000, in a way that I think leaves China uncomfortable because of the leverage that the West and the US in particular have when it comes to geopolitics. In terms of how worried to be about it, and I think Robert's paper makes a major contribution here, there are things to be said on both sides. As he just noted, the dollar remains a hegemon when it comes to international currencies. I think you cited a statistic that 90% of global FX has the dollar on one side of it. And when you look at reserve holdings, when you look at trade flows, yes, China's role proportionally has been growing, but it's still tiny. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be worried. And my sense is that the US, the current US administration has been focused and thoughtful about this. You can see this right at the beginning of President Biden's term when they put out a paper in 2021 on sort of best practices for the use of sanctions. And they affirmatively raise exactly the risks we're talking about today as a reason to be prudent. So I think prudence is important as we go forward, and what that means in different situations is going to be the challenge.
Absolutely. A question for both of you that I'd like to pose is the increase in non-dollar FX, and in particular of the Chinese yuan in places like Russia, evidence that de-dollarization is catching on broadly, or is it a byproduct of sanctions and the sort of psychological impact of recent sanctions that have been seen?
Yeah, I can start. It's a great question. I think that stepping back a moment, right? When we talk about de-dollarization, I think it's important to delineate it between de-dollarization and truly just not using the dollar as a currency versus aiming to increase local currency usage. So countries A and B transacting in either countries A's currency or country B's currency. And then the concept of internationalization, which would be country A and country B transacting in country C's currency, with country C being the one that's trying to internationalize. And so when we look at what's happened with, in the last few months and in the last few years, particularly, since the economic sanctions regime that was put in place against Russia, you have what's notable is that the U.S. and other G7 countries have implemented similar sanctions regimes. And so what that means is that rather than, there had been actually a trend of increased euro usage in transactions between China and Russia prior to that economic sanctions regime. And what we've seen subsequently is that that's stopped. And you're seeing the renminbi increasingly be used. What's, I think, particularly notable is that there are a number of data points out there to suggest that the renminbi is, in response to the economic sanctions regime, being used as that country C's currency, right? So, a country will want to transact with Russia, and they will use the renminbi to do so. And that country that's transacting with Russia is not China, right? Now, is that happening on super large scale? No. Is it happening on enough scale that's worth paying attention? Absolutely, right? It's a notable trend. And so that having been said, I think as Adam was pointing to, it's important to not only get caught up in the economic sanctions debate on this, right? Because there are a number of other push and pull factors driving increased local currency usage. Some of that's financial market infrastructure related. There's been a huge push, not just by China, but also by India and also by other emerging market countries to improve their financial market infrastructure. There's been a large push by other emerging markets to think about how to pin local currency settlement agreements. You've seen a lot of this happening in Southeast Asia with Malaysia and Thailand. As an example, Indonesia has done a lot of this as well. So there are a lot of actions across the world that point to local currency, increased local currency usage. That inherently means not using the dollar, but there still is, that the dollar still is I mean, where it is kind of ranked wise is quite significant. So I think those are some of the dynamics to consider with regards to the trend line for de-dollarization.
Just to add a thought to Robert's points, if you're a bank in, let's say, what we might have once called a non-aligned country, and you're worried about U.S. increased use of economic statecraft, how appealing is the renminbi? Right? Does that address your concerns about, for example, the ability of Beijing to lean on you when you're doing things in your country that are counter to China's interests? Well, if you're sitting in India, that's probably not a very reassuring prospect, right, to make yourself dependent on the renminbi. And I think you can go country by country through the original BRICS and the new BRICS, and there's not necessarily strong alignment in terms of the geopolitics, in terms of their economic interests. So the idea of pivoting away from the dollar, you need to then ask to what? What are you pivoting to? And the renminbi has lots of issues and concerns attached to it, including those we're talking about today. I'll just add a footnote, which is China, which when I was at Treasury made a point about how no unilateral sanctions were legitimate. The only way to legitimately sanction was through the UN Security Council. China's moved away from that, and in the 2020s has adopted statute after statute to sort of build a parallel infrastructure on sanctions to what the US has. So fairly aggressive sanctions, at least skeleton. We'll see what they want to do with that skeleton. But I think that, too, is going to introduce some pause for countries who would think about a reliance on the renminbi going forward.
That's interesting, too, because we've seen, not quite the same extent, but very early efforts to introduce the Indian rupee as another option for some of these BRICS nations who would rather move away from a currency like the dollar or the euro. You know, is India a realistic contender in this de-dollarization story? And does the inclusion of new members affect India's leverage as BRICS members?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's, to build on what Adam was just saying, right? So this was reported, goodness, I think late last summer, perhaps, that there had been increased usage of renminbi by Indian companies in transacting with Russia. And the Indian government reportedly intervened and did not like that, right? And I think for perhaps some of the reasons Adam was bringing up. So the Indian central bank last, I think, fall put out a really interesting paper on rupee internationalization. And for those of you who have free time on your hands this weekend, I encourage you to read it. It's quite interesting, and it really, I think, for people in Washington who are thinking about these issues, provides a very interesting perspective that doesn't fall neatly into some of the boxes that within the debate within which the debate is confined here. I think the Indian government, looking at that paper, they recognize the infrastructure challenges that exist to rupee internationalization. There seems to be a serious effort to address those infrastructure challenges. That doesn't happen overnight. There is the question of capital controls. There's some indications in that paper that was published that the Central Bank of India's posture could be that they think that it's possible to maintain a fairly serious capital controls regime while still internationalizing. They point to what the People's Bank of China has done as an illustrative example. But we'll see, right? I mean, even in a world where the infrastructure is built and policy steps are taken to increase, the rupee's use, I think it's important to fall back to: are we talking about rupee internationalization, or are we talking about local currency usage? And back to that country, are we talking about country A and B using one of their respective currencies? Or are we talking about two countries that aren't India using the rupee? And I think it's much more likely that you would see the former happening in the near term rather than the latter.
Interesting. Adam, a question for you. There is this awkwardness of de-dollarization when it comes to thinking about the impact of sanctions and the U.S. government's role in making sure that the government can accomplish geopolitical objectives through sanctions. How can Washington balance that dynamic, of allowing for potentially more efficient or stable systems while still ensuring that it can achieve those goals?
I was going to say that's the $64,000 question, although that amount of money seems very small these days since the game show went off the air, so maybe we call it now the $64 trillion question. I mean, that was a real issue we discussed and debated while I was at Treasury, and I left 7 years ago, so these issues are not brand new. I don't think the use of economic tools, economic statecraft, whether that's export controls, whether that's sanctions, whether it's tariffs, as we saw in the Trump administration, I don't think that's going anywhere. I think countries have seen the utility as a toolkit to try to affect the behavior of foreign actors, to try to curb certain things like Russia's military efforts. And it's not that there's another toolkit available to which they could pivot if they were worried about some of the second-order effects that we're talking about today. What other toolkit is there to try to shape behavior short of military? Well, people keep coming back to economic for that reason. So I don't think that's going anywhere. But yes, to your question, is there a need for a balance? Absolutely. And I think if you go back to that 2021 Treasury paper, you'll see, if you read between the lines, them wrestling with those exact issues. How do we continue to use these tools in a way that doesn't accelerate a move away from the dollar? One of the key takeaways with which I strongly agree is to act in concert with allies wherever possible. And you've seen that very clearly in the Russia effort, where it has not been a US-Russia, it's been a G7-Russia picture. And if you're thinking not about, well, what share does the dollar have in international currency, but what share does the dollar, the pound, the yen, and the euro have, well, that is global trade. That is global finance. And so I think so long as the US maintains those strong alliances and really ensures that it is lashed up carefully with its allies, we've defended ourselves against some of the sort of harsher effects that could come from use of sanctions.
Just a quick reminder for those in the room and those watching virtually, there's plenty of room for questions. So if you have anything you would like to ask Robert and Adam, please do scan the QR code or type it into the chat. Robert, one interesting thing to me is that we've had BRICS invitees like Argentina, Egypt, and Ethiopia all battling with these dollar shortages and high inflation, which is extremely painful for the economy, for the finance, and for people who are trying to live day to day and buy goods. In Argentina, however, we've seen the use of Chinese swap lines, but also the new president, Javier Milei, has vowed repeatedly to dollarize the economy. What does that tell you about the path of de-dollarization?
Yeah, I think it outlines that that emerging markets are not uniform in their views and their needs, and that there are it's really, I think, important for policymakers here in Washington to consider the idiosyncratic issues in particular emerging markets in deciding what the best U.S. policy posture is. So, I mean, looking at Egypt and Ethiopia for a moment, there are this increased commodity prices, right? I mean, inherently in a world in which commodities are priced in dollars, inherently puts a strain on the foreign exchange supply within a particular jurisdiction, and so that's definitely a policy issue that's important for folks to consider. I think with Argentina, it's interesting what happened last summer before the election, where not only was, as you noted, a PBOC swap line used to facilitate the replenishment of foreign exchange reserves in Argentina, but also the IMF seemingly accepted renminbi as payment. And so, what is that like? Kind of looking ahead at 2024, is that going to happen in the could that happen in the context of some other emerging market? And I think that's where the proliferation of PBOC swap lines is a very important policy issue for U.S. policymakers to track, not only in the context of the dollar's role globally, but also just in the context of the extent to which the Chinese government is able to come to effectively bail out in certain emerging economies.
Yeah, and we've seen that across when you're looking at sovereign debt and restructurings as well, right? China has become a much larger lender to countries in times of need than 20 or 30 years ago by far. We're starting to get a few live audience questions. Adam, I'll ask you this one. How grave are the consequences of the loss of dollar dominance for the U.S. as a security issue?
So first, I would just note, although the questioner may have been just writing for purposes of brevity, the dollar hasn't lost its dominance. The dollar remains the dominant currency in the world. And as I said, when you look at the dollar next to the euro, the pound, and the yen, that dominance very much remains. But if we're looking out ahead, whether it's 20 years, 40 years, what would loss of dollar dominance mean for U.S. security? It's a very big deal. Dollar dominance is not just a nice thing to have when it comes to geopolitical leverage. It's also something that's allowed us to fuel deficit spending for quite a long time, allowed us to support strong government spending on the military. And so it would force the US to start making harder trade-offs than I think we've had to make to date. And it's something to really safeguard against. As with many things that are probably debated within this building, it can be hard to get policymakers to treat with urgency things that are in the medium to long-term future, even if they're serious risks. And one of the important things is for sober, thoughtful policymakers to be focusing on those things in the now.
Robert, can you say something about the role that cryptocurrencies or nationally backed digital currencies play or can play in the push among countries to de-dollarize?
Sure. So I think it's important in the context of cross-border payments, and which is what we're talking about primarily in this debate. I mean, when you think about the dollar's role, right, in the world, you have payments, right, the extent to which the dollar is used in cross-border payments, reserves, the extent to which dollar-denominated assets are a component of central bank reserves globally. And then you also have the denomination of securities and both in the equity markets and then in debt markets, to the extent to which those are dollar denominated. And so then in the context, I think with what this question is raising is it's focused more on the payments lane. When you look at how money flows globally, right, a very large share of that money is flowing globally through what's called large value financial market infrastructure, large value payments systems. There's various terms, and a common element of those systems and arrangements is that transactions are being settled through central bank liabilities, and those central bank liabilities are generally digitized. And so then there's a debate about whether new technologies would be used to enhance or create parallel financial market infrastructure to facilitate large value payments. I think one example to point to of this happening would be what's called the M-Bridge. It involves the Bank of Thailand, the PBOC, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and then a new BRICS member, the Central Bank of the UAE. And that effort aims to effectively create a lower cost, large value payments infrastructure between those four jurisdictions. They had a pilot relatively recently. And so, trends like that I think are important to watch, where there is a use of new technologies, distributed ledgers, what some would call blockchain, what some would not call blockchain, to facilitate large value payments. So I think M-Bridge is a good case study if one wants to see how new technologies are potentially going to be used to transform financial flows in a large value payments context.
And when we're talking about these financial flows, I mean, trade is clearly a huge portion of this conversation. And for countries like Iran, China, Russia, and even Brazil with its agricultural rivalry, participation makes some sense, according to one of our live audience questions. But what are South Africa's motives?
You can go ahead.
Yeah, so South Africa is quite interesting in that really, if we're going to dive deep into the weeds of financial market infrastructure, which is presumably why people are here, you have one of the large foreign exchange settlement systems. I mean, that facilitates that basically takes away settlement risk in a foreign exchange transaction. South Africa's rand is the only. Their central bank is the only participant in that system. So that's notable in that South Africa does have is kind of somewhat different than the others in that regard. That having been said, right? I mean, you've had rhetoric coming out of South Africa's government talking about trying to increase local currency settlement, and so that's also so that's very much part of this debate. And then we will see kind of how that goes in this coming year. with regards to whether South Africa is, they've also done, central bank digital currency experiments and stuff like that. So we'll see where that debate goes. But I think the real thing to watch in the BRICS bloc with regards to where countries land on these issues that we've been discussing is kind of the differences between where China's central bank lands versus India's central bank versus Russia, which is now chairing BRICS.
Adam, another question. Is the mic working? Oh, sorry. Adam, a question for you. Are there any actions that the U.S. should not do to protect the dollar that might make the situation worse? What misguided defenses of the dollar should be avoided?
Misguided defenses of the dollar. That's a great question. That's the first time I've ever gotten it. So kudos to you in the room or online who asked. Well done. I mean, I probably, to do a good job with the question, would need to take it back and consider it. I would say, in general, efforts to force countries, banks, companies to use something is probably not in the U.S.'s interests. And of course, one of the reasons the dollar is so strong is the free access to it and the fact that we're seen as a country that is stable, that has a good rule of law. And so the popularity and the network effect that Robert was talking about earlier is due to its freedom and liberal access. So I think what we'd want to avoid is constraining that or putting conditions on that in a bid to try to preserve what we have.
Good answer, thank you. How does de-dollarization tie into broader efforts led by the so-called Global South to reduce the influence of power of the U.S. and allies within that global order, particularly through the remaking of global economic institutions? I'll let you guys decide who wants to take that one.
I think that's you.
Sure. So, I mean, I'll go back to a response I gave previously to a question, which is I think it's really important to view, each emerging market country differently, right? And so what may be in the interest of one is not necessarily in the interest of others. And so I think, there is this term out there called the Global South. Look, I think there are certainly efforts afoot to to increase local currency usage across a variety of emerging market countries, right? The whole point of the paper I put out, right, is to make the case that isn't uniformly a matter about economic sanctions. It's not uniformly an issue of U.S. monetary policy. It's not uniformly an issue of emerging markets, central banks having issues with U.S. seniorage. So what it really is about is the various particular needs of emerging market jurisdictions. I think that's where, to the extent people in Washington can be focused on understanding and reacting to those particular dynamics in each emerging market, that's where efforts are best spent.
We have another question involving foreign trade. As we all know, use of the U.S. dollar is used widely in trade operations for port services, to hedge operations, for ship owners. Can the Belt and Road Initiative change dollar dominance by controlling services?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Sure. Can the Belt and Road change dollar dominance by controlling services?
Yeah, I guess one way to look at that question would be to say, along Belt and Road Initiative countries, there's been a proliferation of renminbi financial market infrastructure, whether that be Chinese state-owned clearing bank affiliates or, financial institutions that offer renminbi products. So to the extent that that's happening, the Belt and Road Initiative is certainly an important thing to watch.
Yeah.
Adam, to what extent will de-dollarization allow countries that do not use the dollar to evade U.S. sanctions?
So it's an interesting question, and I wonder what the questioner means by countries that do not use the dollar. I mean, when you say that, I think of maybe North Korea. It's hard to think of a country that doesn't use the dollar. I'm sure the dollar is even in use in North Korea. Russia, as you'll see when you all read Robert's paper, still has, what did you say, a third of its exports had dollar denomination, and that's at the end of 2023. So I'm sure it will fall further, predictably, as the war and the sanctions continue. But dollar usage is everywhere. And I think when people look at certain things like Russia settling trade with India or Russia settling trade with China outside of the dollar, that could be called de-dollarization in one way, in the sense that, well, how was that trade denominated? 2 years ago, that was in dollar. So it's been moved to another channel, and that was out of necessity. Russia's been subjected to so many sanctions, they've had to find new pipelines and have had to find alternatives to SWIFT when it comes to secure bank messaging. But that doesn't mean that the banks in India or China are free of the dollar. They're desperately reliant on the dollar. One interesting point to look to on that is President Biden issued an executive order in late December that effectively said to global financial institutions, if you're facilitating trade with Russia's military-industrial complex, we reserve the right to cut you off from the US dollar. So imagine, for example, a bank in Kazakhstan, a bank in Turkey that is doing trade with Russia and maybe doing trade with Russia blindly. They don't care what it is. Maybe it's military, maybe it's dual use, maybe it's benign. They're not doing that trade in dollars. But that doesn't mean that bank is free of its dependence on the dollar. If you want to get free of your dependence on the dollar, that means telling your customers, none of you can do global trade or investments in the United States. That's something that we haven't seen any major bank be prepared to do. Maybe a tiny rural regional bank somewhere. Some have speculated that the increased use of sanctions will lead to the development of specialty banks that will be specialized to just the renminbi. So you could imagine a bank maybe in India that only does renminbi trade. But that idea right now is absurd, and it certainly would not be appealing to any bank of significance whose customers are going to need access to international investments, international cross-border payments to many countries, not just to Russia. So I'm saying all of that to push back maybe on this idea of de-dollarization. The fact that you can do some trade, not on the dollar, doesn't mean that you are not reliant on the dollar, and in some ways still subject to leverage from G7 countries and from the US.
I think that begs the question then, how much of this conversation about de-dollarization is a little premature? Clearly the dollar is still sort of the king currency of the world. Are we talking about this now because we're starting to see movement, or is this something within the next 10, 15 years, king dollar could actually get knocked off its pedestal?
I can answer first and then let Robert add, because I'm sure he'll have valuable thoughts here as well. I don't think there's any risk to the dollar's preeminence in the short term. The way I sometimes talk about it with my students is, if you imagine there's a curve, and in the next, whatever it is, 30, 50 years, the dollar's dominance will erode in a substantial way, US policymakers have to be careful that they're not bending that curve to be steeper so that that erosion happens sooner. So I don't think it's premature to be having today's discussion, and I don't think it's at all premature for policymakers to be watching what's happening in the BRICS discussions, watching what's happening with Russia. I think all of that is exactly right. I just think we need to temper the level of alarm and have the discussion against sort of a fact-based basis.
Yeah, I would build on that. Look, I think it's important to differentiate between the act of de-dollarizing versus a de-dollarized economy, right? I mean, or like a de-dollarized world of trade. And those are two very different things. I think it's very safe to say that there's a number of emerging market jurisdictions, BRICS members, that are working to de-dollarize in the sense of incremental reductions in the use of the dollar in particular transactions, perhaps reduced dollar exposure within central bank reserves. So I think that's very real, and it has it's a debate that shouldn't. It's a reality that shouldn't cloud one's perspective on what the long-term role of the dollar is in the global economy, right? I mean, two things can be true. I mean, we can have marginal decreases in the use of the dollar in particular emerging markets and substantial decreases in certain emerging markets that actually on net don't necessarily make a huge dent in the dollar's role globally, but the geopolitical ramifications of that are quite significant, right? And so it's important to distinguish those things. And that's I think where I come out. I mean, this is, there's, I mean, and you're surely aware, just given some of the reporting you do, is that I mean, the dollar's role in emerging markets and just in debt issuances is incredible, right? And it's incredibly important to central bank operations globally. But we are indeed seeing a desire to build out alternative financial market infrastructure, and how that's used over time, is certainly something important to watch here in Washington, and to be responsive to issues and concerns out there regarding the efficiency of our own payments infrastructure.
I'm curious if it's a fair assessment to think about de-dollarization as something that BRICS leaders and emerging market leaders are starting to embrace in terms of policymaking and rhetoric, but that in terms of U.S. policymakers, perhaps it's something to watch, but not yet. Are there actionable things that the U.S. can do in this space?
To me, I think a lot of it comes down to what not to do. So if the U.S. is seen to be using its tools of economic statecraft to be weaponizing the dollar, to use a phrase that's been coined, and doing so in a unilateral way, in a highly aggressive way, which can include the use of secondary sanctions or extraterritorial sanctions, and it's seen to be doing this with sort of greater and greater frequency, all of those things are likely to intensify efforts among the BRICS and among other countries to find alternatives. So that's the last thing we ought to be doing. What does that mean in any specific case? How should the US react to X foreign crisis? For example, Russia's blitzkrieg on Kyiv. Well, it's very hard in that moment to say, okay, we're not going to use the economic tool because we're worried about 30 years from now, de-dollarization. So having been at Treasury during difficult moments, it's hard to balance in those moments of crisis. But I think what you're seeing is an attempt to be highly multilateral, an attempt to reassure our friends, our allies, our partners that we're going to continue to act in a way that is stable, that a way that is consistent with U.S. best practices and principles, including in that Treasury paper.
Robert, I think this question will be one for you. Can you speak to the rift within BRICS between the more anti-U.S. bloc of Russia and China, et cetera, and the countries more in favor of commerce with the West, like Brazil and South Africa? How might this impact efforts at establishing an alternative to the dollar?
Yeah, I think that it's important to observe the variety of countries within the BRICS bloc and the expanded BRICS bloc. As for what that means for some of the kind of trends in currency usage that we've been talking about, look, I think there's plenty of countries that are U.S. strategic partners that have penned local currency settlement agreements, right? And you've seen that a lot again in East and Southeast Asia with Japan, for example. That trend, right, is what countries are doing in response to a variety of issues, including just macroeconomic shifts, and that is not, the geopolitical element of that is very different than what we're seeing with countries like Russia. I think how BRICS tasked itself with putting out some study, I think, later this year on efforts it wants to take to accelerate local currency settlement usage. I imagine with Russia as chair of BRICS this year that they certainly have a tone that they would like that statement to take. It'll be interesting to see the role that India plays in those types of deliberations, and same with South Africa, and where this ultimately all lies. But at the end of the day, I think one of the important things to never lose sight of is it's easy to get kind of caught up in new financial market infrastructure existing, new banking relationships existing between BRICS members, new banking affiliates being stood up in Latin America by Chinese state-owned banks. But ultimately, the real question is there is a demand. Well, not the real question, but an important question is the demand side to this. Do people actually want to use these non-dollar currencies? And so, I think that'll be an important thing to watch, and how markets respond to various policy initiatives, because it's not a given that even if a new fancy financial market infrastructure is stood up, that will inherently drive increased usage of the currency that it's meant to facilitate global use of.
And as we come to the last couple minutes of today's event, if you do have any questions, do make sure to get them in. Another one from the audience. Can you say a bit more about prospects for BRICS expansion and the role that it might play in this area? Obviously, BRICS are dominated by its namesake countries, but will expansion dilute their national priorities within the bloc?
I can offer an initial thought, which is even within the original BRICS, there's very imperfect alignment in terms of economic and geopolitical goals, as we were talking about earlier. And then when you expand that heterogeneity grows even further. So it'll be interesting to watch. I think the last BRICS conference was very notable for how loud and repeatedly you heard the statements about worries about the dollar, worries about the US use of sanctions, the need for alternatives. That was kind of on the diagnosis side and very quiet on the prescription side. In terms of what should we do about it? Is the future the renminbi? I don't think so, as we were talking about earlier, at least not for certain BRICS countries. And then when you expand it, those disagreements get even more rife, I would say.
Yeah, and, just to build on that point, I mean, there is a question of, in a world in which you start to use these non-dollar currencies and you start to accumulate a lot of these non-dollar currencies, what do you do with it, right? And this has been an issue with the rupees usage in cross-border trade with Russia, was that Russia started receiving all these rupees, and they want, what do we do with these rupees? Because there's a very liquid market for dollar-denominated assets of all sorts of varieties around the world, and you can buy all sorts of commodities in dollars, and the pricing is based on markets, and that's a well-established paradigm. So they're really, I mean, going back to the network effects of this, I mean, they're really, really significant, and that's inherently in any effort to increase the use of non-dollar currencies, particularly local currencies in BRICS economies, is going to be a significant challenge.
And as we think about the makeup of BRICS, how does this proceed in a bloc that has two countries with dollar-pegged currencies?
Yeah, I mean, it's notable, right? So Saudi Arabia and UAE, and I mean, this speaks to, I think, in part, the importance of the dollar in commodity markets, right? And just how much of the global commodity trade is priced and settled in dollars. So I think, you hear folks here in Washington concerned sometimes about, the petro yuan, and whether, you'll see use of the renminbi to settle oil transactions in large scale. There late last year, I mean, I think an interesting trend to watch is the financial market infrastructure build out between China and Saudi Arabia. So, as I mentioned earlier, there was the launch of a swap line between the Saudi and Chinese central banks late last year. So important to watch that and see kind of what materializes there. There's also been the launch of new Chinese state-owned bank affiliates in Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, I mean, the commodity markets globally, I mean, the reliance on the dollar is quite significant, and so that's not a paradigm that will be shattered overnight.
Adam, I'm curious, especially when we talk about the Chinese currency's use in this trend, How would China's policies on convertibility need to change for the currency to be more widely used in these avenues?
So I'll put in an initial disclaimer, which is I'm not an economist. I worked at Treasury, but more on the national security side, and my background and training is as a lawyer. So I'm not the person to ask about convertibility, although I'm sitting next to someone who is an expert. I'll just say that in talking to people over the last years, that does seem to be a restraint in terms of how willing China is to see greatly increased holding and use of the renminbi. Does that come with a loss of control? And China, and Robert alluded to this at the start of the hour, China is seen as having been able to achieve, at the same time, retaining tight controls while growing the international use of the renminbi. But I guess the question would be, what does that look like as the renminbi's use would expand?
Yeah, and there's a really interesting paper that was published, I think, last year, and I cite to it in the paper I put out, which talks about, I mean, the relationship between the dollar and the renminbi, right? Which is, I think, when you look at how China's ability the PBOC's ability to maintain and influence the value of the renminbi relies heavily on its purchase and sale of dollar-denominated assets, right? And so there's a line of thinking out there that goes as follows, which is that you need to have that one would need to have relatively liquid renminbi dollar foreign exchange markets in order for the renminbi to grow in greater use internationally, in part because people still are going to want to have the ability to exchange renminbi for dollars, right? And so that's one line of thinking. I mean, it's certainly an interesting way of approaching the issue because it when you take that to its logical end, it presents a really odd relationship that the U.S. and China have, which with regards to the currencies linkages to one another.
Another question from our audience is whether you have any comments on Saudi Arabia and the impact on the petrodollar. Are they serious about BRICS, or is it posturing?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I tried to answer that in an earlier question. I think the swap line is important to look at. The swap line that's been established between the Saudi central bank and the Chinese central bank. There's also been various memoranda of understanding and agreements signed between various Chinese state-owned and Saudi entities with regards to cross-border payments. So those are important issues to watch. The dollar's dominance in commodity markets remains quite significant, and any change to that is going to be, I think, a gradual thing.
This is sort of a... Sorry, a few microphone issues. Apologies for that. This I find a pretty entertaining question. Can you relate de-dollarization within this new BRICS coalition to their space endeavors? Going to space costs money, and the group seems to be growing in their ambitions to go to space.
That might be for a third panelist.
Yeah.
Not currently on our panel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interplanetary currencies. I mean, I guess you could interpret that question to mean for the use of government spending. Is there a future that hinges on a de-dollarized future?
Yeah, I think the way that I look at it is, and we were talking earlier about it before this panel, is that you can look at a lot of the build out of financial market infrastructure as like building a really fancy train, right? And so, or spaceship, we'll call it a spaceship. And so it's you can spend a lot of money and time and human capital to build this really fancy thing, but at the end of the day, there has to be a reason to use it and a desire to use it. And so I think that's where trying my best to answer the question is I think when with regards to the build out of financial market infrastructure, whether it be renminbi financial infrastructure, or rupee financial market infrastructure, or various new financial market infrastructure projects that exist,
some of these on their face, right, can, facilitate lower transaction costs, all things like liquidity in the market held equal. But at the end of the day, if the old financial market infrastructure has like 1,000 times more people participating in it, the forces of supply and demand are going to drive down the cost, because that's fundamentally one of the biggest issues you see with emerging market currencies, is that you can have very illiquid markets, and that inherently drives up the cost, and that's why you've seen the dollar play this role as a bridge between various emerging market currencies. So.
This is a good question. Many in the Global South feel that the aspirations of BRICS is to have independence from a Western-dominated financial system. How can the U.S. continue to make the dollar and the Western-dominated system appealing to non-BRICS countries?
I mean, I think the appeal is already built in, which is by far the easiest, safest, most reliable system in the world. Anyone who's building a system from scratch, to get to Robert's last point, it might have the latest technology behind it, but it doesn't have the users. It doesn't yet have the demand, which means it doesn't have the efficiencies. I think when you talk about perceptions of the Global South, the important thing, and I realize in a sense we're in a discussion about economics, but I come back to diplomacy and coalitions. The important thing is that the U.S. tend its alliances, tend its friendships, its partnerships, and its relationships abroad. And we're not always great at doing that. The more we're doing that, the more I think there will be a sense of ease. And then we don't have to sell the dollar. The dollar is already strong for reasons that countries know. It's easy for reasons countries know, and it's attractive on its own. The danger is if we're not tending those alliances, and if countries see the U.S. as impetuous, as rash, as unilateral, so at that point, there starts to be a level of anxiety that begins to rise. And while it's expensive, inefficient, and painful to pivot away from the dollar and Western currencies, if you get anxious enough, you can sort of raise the costs of the status quo to a point where people begin to consider it. I know that's a very oversimplified way of looking at it, but that's sort of my perspective.
We have time for...
Here, try this.
Oh, the mic is back anyways. I think we had a question in the room, though.
Just to take, sorry, my name is Winston.
Sir?
London.
Here's a mic.
Sorry, my name is Winston. I'm from London. Just to take back from what you've just said in terms of promoting the dollar, encouraging other countries outside the BRICS to continue to use the dollars. I think you went a little bit, but not as far as I was hoping, that one of the primary reasons, or one of the easiest factor one can say to encourage the usage of dollars is promoting liberal democracy in virtually, for instance, in most part of Africa, rather than protecting authoritarian and dictatorial governments in most of this part of the world. Just to end, in most part of Africa, the ordinary trader, not the big ones, the ordinary trader would prefer handling the dollar even than the British pound, which I dear so much. so it is the question of liberal democracy, promoting liberal democracy. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you've done is introduce values-based diplomacy into my earlier comments, and I think that's a friendly amendment.
Thank you. Prior to the last BRICS meeting, the Western governments and the media dismissed the importance of the meeting before it even happened. So that would lead me to believe that despite the technicalities, the Western media and the Western governments behind it are concerned and are somewhat afraid of the potential of the BRICS. It may have very tiny capital base now and not much de-dollarization, but its potential is significant because you're looking at the whole South-South, Global South as a possibility. So isn't there a tendency of the West to, let's say, poo-poo the BRICS out of ideological reasons and missing the point that this is something in the potential that could be a new dynamic in the world? And didn't the new development bank say they were going to increase their non-dollar trade by 30% in the last meeting? So isn't that something else to be concerned about?
Robert, you want to take that?
Sure. So I think I can answer that, and by piggybacking off what Adam was saying in his last comments, and it gets to another point I was hoping to make in its response to the other question, which is that one of the things that I think it's very important is to look at the map and try to identify emerging markets where there's issues with access to dollar financial market infrastructure. And I think one of the, from a proactive policy perspective, what can people here in Washington be focused on that's can improve the U.S.'s posture. One of those things is kind of countering the challenge of de-risking, whereby U.S. financial institutions have for a variety of reasons challenges operating in certain lower income countries. And so to the extent we can find creative policy solutions to expand access to dollar financial market infrastructure in emerging markets, it's kind of a win-win for everybody involved, and certainly for U.S. strategic interests. And one can be in favor of that and then hold varying views on other issues, but at least expanding access to dollar financial market infrastructure in emerging markets where access may be limited would probably be a good place to start.
That puts us right at 3. We have time for maybe one very quick, so fast. Just one sec for the microphone so those online can hear, please. Thank you.
My 3, but I don't think you answered my 3rd, which was the project for a common BRICS currency. I'm not sure I heard you answer that one. There was one of the announcements at the last BRICS meeting was there was going to be an effort over 5 or 10 years. They said sooner, but to create a common BRICS currency. I don't know if you have an answer for that.
Yeah, so there was also a comment made at the event where that dismissed that was actually going to be something that's done, and just I think going back to 2009, that idea has been discussed, but especially with an expanded BRICS, incredibly difficult to operationalize.
Thank you so much for all the questions in the room and that came on online. Thanks for taking the time to listen today, and thank you so much, Adam and Robert. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, Sydney.
Thanks.
Thanks.